Helga Müller stood frozen at the entrance to the American prisoner of war camp near Nancy, France, on December the 12th, 1944. The 23-year-old auxiliary radio operator from the Wehrmacht's Women's Signal Corps blinked in disbelief, certain her eyes were deceiving her. What Helga saw defied 6 years of careful indoctrination by the Reich's propaganda ministry. Before her, German women prisoners, captured just weeks earlier during the Allied push through France, sat at tables beneath canvas tents, eating from trays piled with food. Not thin soup or the black bread that had become standard rations back home, but mounds of potatoes, meat, vegetables, and even fruit. The portions were larger than what her family in Dresden had seen in years. A prisoner nearby casually discarded half a sandwich into a waste bin, an act that would have been unthinkable in Germany, where every crumb was precious. "It cannot be real," she whispered to herself, as an American guard ushered her forward. "This must be some elaborate deception." But the aroma of fresh coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz brew made from roasted barley that Germans had subsisted on for years, hung in the air. The sounds of women laughing drifted across the compound. What Helga and thousands of other captured German women would discover in American captivity would shatter not just their expectations, but the very foundation of beliefs that had sustained them through the war. Their journey from captives to unwitting witnesses of American abundance would transform them into some of the most effective, if unintentional, opponents of the Nazi worldview. The capture of German women's auxiliary units was not something either side had adequately prepared for. While the 1943 manpower shortages had forced the Third Reich to increasingly rely on female personnel in non-combat roles, Nazi propaganda continued to present this as temporary and exceptional. By 1944, however, more than 500,000 German women served in military support roles, from signal operators and administrative staff to anti-aircraft auxiliaries. These women had been raised in a Germany that glorified austerity and sacrifice. From the economic hardships of the 1920s through the controlled scarcity of the 1930s, an entire generation had been taught that privation was noble, that Germany's destiny required sacrifice, and that the decadent democracies of the West were morally and spiritually weak despite their material advantages. Hermann Göring's famous dictum that guns will make us powerful, butter will only make us fat, had become a guiding principle. The women who now wore the gray auxiliary uniforms had grown up with ration cards, with carefully darned stockings, with making do on less. They believed that their American enemies, softened by luxury and excess, would crumble when faced with determined German resistance. The Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had been especially effective at portraying Americans as materialistic but soft, unable to withstand hardship, and lacking the spiritual fortitude that supposedly distinguished the German people. Joseph Goebbels had masterfully woven a narrative that acknowledged America's industrial might, while simultaneously dismissing it as ultimately meaningless against German determinations and efficiency. Photographs of American factories carefully omitted context to suggest small-scale production rather than the vast industrial complexes they actually were. Stories of American supply problems were amplified, while successes were minimized or attributed to luck rather than capacity. German women were told that American soldiers received only the most basic equipment and supplies, that their rations were barely adequate, and that American prisoners would be shocked by the relative comfort of German POW camps. The reality, as these women would discover, was precisely the opposite. The military situation that led to the capture of German women's units evolved rapidly in the latter half of 1944. After the successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th, German forces had been pushed steadily eastward. By September, Allied armies had liberated most of France and parts of Belgium. The Wehrmacht's desperate attempts to establish defensive lines meant that support personnel, including women's signal corps units, administrative staff, and medical auxiliaries, often found themselves closer to the front than doctrine allowed. When American forces broke through near Metz in November 1944, they unexpectedly captured several facilities where German women's units were operating. American commanders, finding themselves responsible for over 3,000 female German military personnel by December 1944, established specialized sections within existing POW camps, awaiting more permanent facilities. The women arrived as true believers. Surveys conducted by American intelligence officers during initial processing revealed that 87% expressed absolute confidence in ultimate German victory, despite the obvious reversal of fortunes on the battlefield. 73% reported that they expected harsh treatment and inadequate food in captivity, based on what they had been told about American resources and character. 91% believed that conditions in American POW camps would be worse than what they had experienced in Germany during the war. They could not have been more mistaken, and the collision between their expectations and reality would prove psychologically seismic. Gretel Hoffmann, a 27-year-old administrative clerk captured near Saarbrücken, wrote in a diary that American intelligence would later analyze, "They are feeding us better than we have eaten since before the war. I feel ashamed to admit it, but I have gained 4 pounds in just 2 weeks here. The Americans throw away more food than we sometimes had in a week at home. Yesterday I saw a soldier discard an entire chocolate bar because he said it had become too soft in the sun. I wanted to rush over and take it from the rubbish bin. What would my mother say if she knew that our enemies live with such casual abundance while she continues to make soup from potato peelings?" This diary entry from December 28, 1944, captures the beginning of a profound shift in perspective that would be repeated thousands of times across the female prisoner population. The journey of discovery began with food, always food. The contrast was simply too stark to ignore or explain away. The average daily caloric intake for a German civilian in late 1944 ranged between 1,000 and 1,500 calories, barely enough for subsistence. Female auxiliaries in the Wehrmacht typically received slightly better rations, averaging around 1,800 calories daily. In American POW camps, German women prisoners received the same basic rations as American support personnel, approximately 3,400 calories daily. The food was not only more plentiful, but more varied and of higher quality than anything available in Germany, even to the privileged. Captain Eleanor Sampson, an American Women's Army Corps officer assigned to oversee one of the women's POW sections, recorded her observations in a February 1945 report. The German women prisoners initially suspected the food was part of an elaborate propaganda display. Several refused to eat, convinced we were showing them abundance while planning to reduce their rations once their guard was down. One prisoner, a Fräulein Weber, kept a journal recording every meal, apparently to document when the quality would deteriorate. After 6 weeks, she approached me in tears, saying she had believed her whole life that Americans lived in relative poverty compared to Germans. She asked if ordinary American civilians ate this way too. When I told her that rationing at home was far less restrictive than what she was experiencing in the camp, she simply walked away, visibly shaken. The revelation extended beyond mere quantity to variety and quality. Lotte Schmidt, a 22-year-old auxiliary who had worked in communications near Strasbourg until her capture in January 1945, wrote in a letter that was intercepted by camp censors, "Dearest Mother, you would not believe what we eat here. Yesterday we had eggs, real eggs, not powder, with bacon and white bread. White bread, Mother. There was real butter and strawberry jam. The Americans eat this every single day for breakfast. They complain when the eggs are not perfectly cooked. Last week they served us roast beef that would have been reserved for high-party officials at home. I have seen the American soldiers' own rations. They are identical to ours. This is not special treatment to impress us. This is how they actually live." The letter continues with a passage that American intelligence flagged as particularly significant. I am beginning to understand why the Führer never wanted us to surrender. It is not because the Americans would mistreat us. It is because they would show us the truth. The women's quarters themselves delivered the second shock. While not luxurious by civilian standards, the barracks provided to female prisoners were clean, heated, and spacious compared to what many had experienced in their own military accommodations. Each prisoner received a metal bed with a mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow, sheets that were changed weekly, and personal hygiene items including soap, toothpaste, and sanitary products. For women who had grown accustomed to shortages of even the most basic items, this standardized allocation seemed extraordinary. Ursula Koenig, a 25-year-old who had served in an anti-aircraft auxiliary unit, noted in a censored letter, "We each receive a new bar of soap every week. It is simply handed out, as if soap grows on trees. At home, I had not seen a new bar of soap in over a year. We shared small slivers among 4 people. Here, some of the women use their soap for washing clothes and then ask for more. To my astonishment, they receive it without question. There is hot water every day, not just once a week. How can they afford to heat so much water? Where does it all come from?" The provision of clothing delivered yet another blow to preconceptions. As the initial capture uniforms wore out, the women were issued standard American WAC uniforms with POW markings. The quality of the fabric, the durability of the shoes, and the sheer number of items allocated to each prisoner contradicted everything they had been told about American manufacturing. Ilse Weber, who had worked as a seamstress before joining the women's auxiliaries, examined her issued clothing with professional interest. In a conversation recorded by an undercover intelligence officer in March 1945, she remarked to fellow prisoners, "Look at the stitching on this seam. All machine done, perfect tension, no weak points. And the fabric, this would be officer-grade wool at home. I once made a dress for the wife of a Gauleiter that was not as finely woven as these simple trousers they give to prisoners, and they have warehouses full of these." I asked the supply sergeant how many uniforms they had in storage. He shrugged and said, "Enough to clothe everybody twice over, I guess." He didn't even know the exact number. They have so many, they don't bother to count precisely. The camp stores, where prisoners could purchase additional items with credit earned through camp work, became another window into American abundance. German women could buy chocolate, cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and even cosmetics. The prices were nominal and the supply seemed inexhaustible. For women who had lived with strict rationing for years, the casual availability of luxury items was almost incomprehensible. Frida Kruger, who had been a telephone operator in Frankfurt before her conscription, described the PX post-exchange in a letter to her sister that never made it past the censors. "There is a small shop here where we can buy things with the money we earn, working in the laundry. Yesterday I bought a lipstick and a small mirror. Think of it, Hannah, a lipstick. When I went to pay, the American girl running the counter asked if I wanted the red or the pink shade. They had choices. I stood there like a fool, unable to decide because I hadn't seen a new lipstick for sale in 3 years. While I was trying to choose, 3 American nurses came in and bought chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum without ration coupons, without special permissions, without anything but money. They did not seem to find this remarkable at all. Medical care in the camps delivered perhaps the most personal revelation about American capacity. German women prisoners received the same level of medical attention as American personnel. This included dental care, eyeglasses if needed, and access to medications that had become scarce in Germany. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a U.S. Army physician assigned to the women's section of a POW camp near Reims, documented the health transformations she observed. The improvement in the physical condition of the German women prisoners is remarkable. Upon arrival, 62% showed signs of nutritional deficiencies, primarily vitamins A, C, and D. Dental issues were nearly universal. After 3 months in custody, these deficiencies have been largely corrected. Average weight gain is 11 pounds per prisoner. Several have commented that they haven't felt so healthy in years. One patient, while being treated for a minor respiratory infection, asked me how America could afford to waste penicillin on prisoners. She explained that in her hospital in Germany, such medications were reserved for critical cases and high-ranking officers. The concept of standard care regardless of status seems to be particularly difficult for them to comprehend. The revelations continued to mount as the prisoners observed the everyday operations of the camps. The seemingly limitless supply of fuel for heating and transportation, the abundance of paper used for administrative purposes, the casual use of resources that had become precious in Germany, all contributed to a growing sense that they had been fundamentally misled about the nature of their enemy and, by extension, about the war itself. Margaret Fisher, a 30-year-old former schoolteacher who had joined the Women's Corps in 1943, described her dawning realization in a personal journal discovered after her repatriation. "What disturbs me most is not the abundance itself, but what it means. If the Americans can feed, clothe, and house thousands of prisoners at this standard while simultaneously fighting a war on 2 continents, what does that say about their true capacity? We were told their production was exaggerated, that their supply lines were fragile, that they could not sustain a prolonged conflict. Yet I see no evidence of strain. Quite the opposite. There seems to be no bottom to their resources. I'm beginning to understand that we were not just fighting a different army, we were fighting a different reality." As winter turned to spring in 1945, the accumulation of evidence became overwhelming. The German women witnessed the constant flow of new equipment to frontline units, the rotation of personnel for rest and training, and most shockingly, the casual disposal of items that would have been carefully repaired and reused in the Wehrmacht. An intelligence report dated April 1945 noted, "Female prisoners assigned to camp maintenance duties expressed particular disbelief when observing American disposal practices. The concept of salvage versus waste appears to be creating significant cognitive dissonance. Several have been observed retrieving items from disposal areas, not necessarily for personal use, but seemingly out of a cultural inability to witness waste." When questioned, one prisoner explained that in Germany, vehicle parts would be repaired until absolutely unusable, whereas she had seen Americans discard components at the first sign of wear. The statistical disparities became impossible to ignore. While exact production figures were classified, the prisoners could observe the constant flow of supplies and draw their own conclusions. Intelligence officers noted that the women, many of whom had worked in administrative roles, were particularly adept at noticing and interpreting logistical patterns. They saw the serial numbers on equipment that revealed production dates and volumes. They noted the frequency of supply deliveries and the casual abundance of even the most mundane items. For women who had managed inventories in Germany, constantly stretching inadequate resources, the American approach to supply seemed almost recklessly wasteful, yet undeniably effective. The numbers revealed a truth no propaganda could hide. America's industrial output dwarfed Germany's in nearly every category. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft to Germany's 40,000. American factories turned out over 29,000 tanks compared to Germany's 9,000. Even more telling were the everyday items. The U.S. could produce 750 million cans of preserved food per month, more than Germany manufactured in an entire year. These statistics were not directly shared with the prisoners, but the evidence of this productivity gap was visible in every aspect of camp life. Helene Brandt, who had worked as a statistical clerk for the Wehrmacht before her capture, pieced together the production reality from her observations. In a conversation recorded by Camp Intelligence in May 1945, she told fellow prisoners, "Based on what I can see just in this camp and multiplying by what must be happening across all the territories they occupy, the Americans must be producing at least 5 times what Germany can make in most categories. The supply trucks arrive with such regularity, always full, never waiting for critical shortages before delivery. Do you know what this means? It means they can afford to keep everything at maximum level all the time. We always had to prioritize shells or fuel, vehicles or weapons. They simply provide everything at once, continuously. This war was lost before it began. The cascade effect of these revelations transformed the prisoners' understanding of the broader conflict. Each discovery led to larger realizations. If American abundance extended to prisoners, what must their home front be like? If this was how they treated enemies, how might they live themselves? The questions multiplied, and with them came uncomfortable reassessments of everything the women had been taught. The process was documented in detail through intelligence monitoring, censored mail, and later, post-repatriation interviews that would inform American occupation policies. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thornton, who oversaw intelligence gathering at 3 women's POW facilities, summarized the psychological progression in a June 1945 report. The German women prisoners typically move through several distinct phases of realization. First comes disbelief. They assume what they're seeing is staged for effect. Second is rationalization. They acknowledge the abundance, but attribute it to special circumstances or temporary conditions. Third is the crisis point, usually triggered by some small detail that suddenly makes the full reality undeniable. Finally comes a form of mourning, not just for the lost war, but for the lost worldview. This final stage often manifests as anger, not primarily directed at Americans, but at their own leadership for the deception. The most common refrain we hear is some variation of, "Why did they lie to us about this? What else have they lied about?" This crisis of belief was captured vividly in the experience of Johanna Metzger, a 29-year-old who had served in the Reich's labor service before transferring to a military communications unit. Captured in February 1945, she initially maintained rigid ideological discipline, refusing to acknowledge the evidence before her. Camp records note that she organized small groups of prisoners to maintain morale and resistance to American propaganda. Yet 3 months later, an incident transformed her perspective. According to witness accounts, Metzger was working in the camp administrative office when a supply truck arrived with new typewriter ribbons, 36 of them, when the office had only 4 typewriters. When she asked the American supply sergeant why they needed so many, he responded casually, "Standard issue, 1 dozen per quarter per machine." Metzger reportedly stood silently for a moment before saying, "In my last post in Germany, we had 17 typewriters sharing 1 ribbon. We typed until the words were barely visible, then typed again over the same spot. When we couldn't see the letters at all, we turned the ribbon upside down and used the bottom half." The American sergeant, not understanding the significance of the moment, simply shrugged and said, "That sounds inefficient." Witnesses reported that Metzger returned to the barracks and removed the small Nazi party pin she had kept hidden in her mattress. To her bunkmates, she said simply, "It was all a lie. We never had a chance." Such moments of clarity repeated across the camps, triggered by different observations but following similar patterns. For Greta Hoffmann, who had been a true believer since joining the League of German Girls at age 14, the breaking point came in April 1945 when she was assigned to sort incoming mail for the American personnel. The sheer volume of letters and packages from the United States, many containing items still relatively plentiful despite years of war, contradicted everything she had been told about civilian hardship in America. "The women send their men cookies and chocolates," she wrote in a letter intercepted by censors. "Ordinary women, not just the wealthy or connected. They write about weekend trips and new dresses. They complain about minor inconveniences as if they have no concept of true sacrifice. And there are so many letters, thousands upon thousands, all written on clean white paper with proper envelopes and stamps. In Germany, we write on the margins of newspapers and consider ourselves fortunate to find a scrap of paper at all." The most dramatic revelations often came when prisoners interacted with American women in uniform. The WAC officers and enlisted personnel who helped administer the women's sections of POW camps represented something many German women had been told was impossible: female military service that neither masculinized women nor relegated them to strictly subordinate roles. Captain Anna Miller, a WAC officer who spoke fluent German, documented numerous conversations with prisoners struggling to reconcile American gender roles with Nazi ideology. They are particularly struck by the fact that we returned to civilian professions after the war, Miller wrote. The concept of temporary military service followed by a return to normal life contradicts their understanding of militarization. One prisoner, a former nurse, expressed shock when I mentioned my plans to return to medical school after demobilization. She asked if I would be allowed to become a doctor, or if that privilege would be reserved for returning men. When I explained that women had been practicing medicine in America for decades, she accused me of lying. The next day, she asked if I could prove it with evidence. I showed her my university admissions letter and photographs of women in my program. She studied them silently for several minutes before asking if she could write to the university herself to verify. What happened next shattered years of indoctrination for many prisoners. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, the women in American captivity watched as the mighty Wehrmacht collapsed completely. The final radio broadcasts of the Nazi regime, with their promises of secret weapons and inevitable victory, gave way to silence. Then came the photographs and newsreels of liberated concentration camps, of destroyed German cities, of Hitler's suicide. For women who had already begun questioning the regime's truthfulness based on their observations of American capacity, these revelations triggered profound psychological crises. Camp records from May and June 1945 document increased requests for medical and psychological support, as well as a sharp uptick in religious attendance among the prisoners. The transformation was perhaps most poignantly captured in the experience of Elsa Wagner, a 31-year-old who had served as an administrative assistant at Luftwaffe headquarters before her capture. Wagner had been a model prisoner, cooperative but reserved, maintaining a dignified distance from her American captors. In late May 1945, she was among a group of prisoners shown newsreel footage of Buchenwald shortly after its liberation. According to the camp chaplain who was present, Wagner watched the footage without visible reaction until it ended. She then stood up and addressed the room in perfect English. "I have a doctoral degree in economics from Heidelberg. I specialized in production capacity analysis. I joined the Women's Auxiliaries because I believed Germany needed to defend itself against nations that wished to destroy us. For 6 years, I helped prepare reports claiming that German efficiency would triumph over American waste and decadence. I believed those reports. Now I understand that the greatest waste was not of materials, but of human potential, our potential. We could have built a Germany that produced refrigerators instead of tanks, tractors instead of artillery. We chose wrongly, and we have lost everything." Wagner later volunteered as a translator for the Americans during the early occupation period and eventually emigrated to the United States in 1952. The overwhelming evidence of American industrial and logistical superiority manifested in countless ways throughout the prisoners' captivity. The medical supplies alone told a story of vastly different capacities. Dr. Ingrid Bauer, a German physician who had been serving with a women's medical unit when captured, documented her observations in a journal later donated to the U.S. Army Medical Corps Historical Collection. "Today I assisted the American doctors in the camp hospital. They use penicillin for infections we would treat with sulfa drugs, and they use sulfa drugs for conditions we would simply clean and bandage. Their X-ray equipment is newer than anything I used in Berlin, and they have it here at a temporary facility for prisoners. The pharmacy stocks medications I have only read about in journals. When I asked the American doctor about a particular drug, he mentioned it had been developed just last year, as if constant medical innovation is normal during wartime. In Germany, All research not directly applicable to immediate military needs was suspended years ago. They showed me their field medical kits. Every American medic carries more surgical equipment than I had access to in my regimental aid station. One medic casually mentioned they receive new supplies weekly, whether needed or not. In my last posting, we washed and reused bandages until they fell apart. The scale of American logistics became increasingly apparent as the war in Europe wound down. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the prisoners witnessed the massive supply operations supporting the advance. Hilda Kraus, a 26-year-old who had worked in the transport coordination for the Wehrmacht, was assigned to clerical duties at the camp headquarters where she could observe the daily operations reports. In her debriefing interview after repatriation, she stated, "I saw the daily supply summaries for just one American corps, a fraction of their total force. They moved more fuel, ammunition, and food in a day than my entire department could allocate in a week for a comparable German unit. And they did this over distances we would consider logistically impossible, without significant sacrifice elsewhere in the supply chain. There was no sacrifice. Every category moved simultaneously at maximum volume." In 1943, I attended a planning conference where our logistics officers spent 3 days determining how to distribute inadequate supplies among competing priorities. The Americans seemed to have no such conferences because they had no such problem. The industrial capacity demonstrations became more direct as the war concluded. In some POW camps, the women were shown films of American factory production, endless assembly lines producing aircraft, vehicles, weapons, and supplies in quantities that seemed mathematically impossible. Elizabeth Kruger, who had worked as an accountant before the war, wrote in a letter to her family after repatriation, "They showed us their Ford factory in a place called Willow Run. This single factory produced one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. One factory, one type of aircraft. They had dozens of such factories. The mathematics made it clear we were not fighting a country. We were fighting a continent with limitless resources. The most painful realization was that our leaders must have known this. They sent us to fight anyway." The psychological transformation among the women prisoners followed distinct patterns that American intelligence officers documented thoroughly, creating reports that would later inform occupation and denazification strategies. The initial response was typically disbelief, often manifested as accusations of staged propaganda. Camp records note that she hoarded small portions of each meal, apparently intending to preserve evidence of the deception. After 6 weeks, during which the quality and quantity of food never diminished, she approached an American officer and asked a simple question: "Is this how Americans really eat?" When told that the prisoners' rations were standard military fare, not special provisions, she reportedly replied, "Then we have been starving for no reason at all." Resistance to acceptance was strongest among those who had been most ideologically committed. Margot Steiner, a 24-year-old captured near Metz, insisted for weeks that the food served to prisoners was specially prepared to create false impressions. Women who had held party positions or served as political officers within the women's auxiliaries often attempted to maintain group cohesion through skepticism and discipline. Their efforts became increasingly difficult as evidence mounted, and more prisoners began openly questioning previous beliefs. Ingrid Miller, who had been a supervisor in the League of German Girls before joining a communications unit, organized secret discussion groups in the barracks to maintain morale. Camp informants reported that these meetings initially reinforced Nazi narratives, but gradually transformed into forums for doubt and questioning. By April 1945, Miller herself was reportedly telling younger prisoners, "We must prepare ourselves for a different Germany when we return. Everything we were told about our superiority has proven false. We will need to learn from the Americans if we hope to rebuild." The inevitable surrender to truth came at different times for different women, but camp records indicate that by June 1945, less than 8% of female German prisoners still expressed belief in Nazi ideology when interviewed. More telling was the change in daily behaviors. The careful saving of scraps gave way to American-style consumption patterns. Women who had previously maintained military discipline in their appearance adopted more relaxed American grooming standards. Those who had refused to engage with American personnel beyond minimum requirements began asking questions about American life, education, and culture. Letters home, heavily censored but preserved in intelligence files, reveal the evolving perspectives. Emma Schmidt wrote to her parents in Bavaria in July 1945. "When I return, I will bring new knowledge that will help us rebuild. The Americans have shown me that prosperity does not require conquest, quite the opposite. Their strength comes from production, not destruction. They build rather than take. When they leave Germany, we must remember this lesson." Another prisoner, identified only as KL in the files, wrote more bluntly, "Everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not weak, decadent people. They are not cruel captors. They defeated us not because they were lucky or because we were betrayed, but because they could produce 10 tanks for every one of ours, 20 aircraft for each of ours. They could lose 100 trucks and build 200 more the next day. We never had a chance, and our leaders knew it." Former enemies became unwitting students as the prisoners began actively seeking information about American systems and methods. Camp administrators noted increasing requests for reading materials about American industry, agriculture, and education. Some camps established informal classes taught by American personnel, covering topics from democratic governance to industrial organization. These sessions, initially created as part of the denazification program, found unexpectedly eager audiences among the women who had directly witnessed American capabilities and now sought to understand the systems that made them possible. The transformation extended beyond material assessments to deeper values. Women who had embraced Nazi racial theories found these beliefs unsustainable after months of direct interaction with American personnel of various ethnicities and backgrounds. Johanna Weber, a 28-year-old who had served as a clerical worker at a Luftwaffe base, described her evolution in a post-repatriation interview. "The Negro soldiers troubled me at first. We had been told such terrible things about them. But they operated the supply depot in our camp, and I worked alongside them cataloging inventory. They were educated, efficient, and unfailingly polite, despite knowing I had been their enemy. One sergeant taught me the American inventory system, which was superior to our German method in every way. When I thanked him, he told me he had been a university student before the war and planned to return to his studies. This contradicted everything I had been told about the intellectual capacity and social position of Negroes in America. If they had lied to us about this, what else was untrue? Religious perspectives shifted as well. The Nazi regime had alternately courted and suppressed traditional religious practices, replacing them with state ceremonies and observances. In captivity, many women returned to faith traditions they had abandoned or suppressed. Camp records show steadily increasing attendance at Catholic and Protestant services offered by American chaplains. Several women requested baptism or formal readmission to church communities they had left to advance their careers under the Nazi system. The camp chaplains, both Catholic and Protestant, reported that confessions frequently included admissions of moral compromise and expressions of shame for having believed in Nazi ideology. The lasting impact of this captivity experience would ripple through German society during Reconstruction and beyond. Upon repatriation, the approximately 33,000 women who had been held in American POW camps returned to a devastated Germany with perspectives vastly different from those who had remained at home throughout the conflict. Many became informal ambassadors for American methods and values during the occupation period. Allied administrators noted that communities with higher concentrations of returned women prisoners tended to adapt more quickly to occupation policies and showed greater receptivity to democratic reforms. The specific lessons these women applied to rebuilding proved particularly valuable in the western zones of occupation. Their first-hand experience with American systems gave them unique credibility when explaining new approaches to their communities. Women who had worked in administrative roles in the camps had observed American organizational methods and could implement similar systems in emerging West German institutions. Those who had witnessed American supply operations understood the efficiency gains possible through standardization and redundancy rather than rigid hierarchical control. In thousands of small ways, their captivity experience helped reshape German society from within. The statistical summary of this transformation is revealing. In a 1955 survey of women who had been held in American POW camps, 82% reported that the experience had fundamentally changed their worldview. 91% stated that their standard of living in captivity had been higher than what they experienced in Germany during the war. Perhaps most tellingly, 67% said they had initially believed their captivity experience was exceptional or staged, only to discover after the war that American abundance was genuine and systemic. The ironic observation about history cannot be overlooked. The Nazi regime, which had gone to extraordinary lengths to insulate Germans from outside information and influence, inadvertently created the perfect conditions for ideological conversion among these women prisoners. By consistently underrepresenting American capabilities and overrepresenting German advantages, they established expectations that reality dramatically contradicted. Had Nazi propaganda been more truthful about American industrial might, perhaps these women would have been prepared for what they encountered. Instead, the gap between expectation and reality was so vast that it shattered not just their beliefs about the war, but their entire worldview. The multi-generational effects of this experience continued long after the war. Many former prisoners used their improved English language skills and familiarity with American systems to secure positions with occupation authorities, international organizations, or American companies establishing operations in post-war Germany. Their children grew up hearing first-hand accounts of American abundance that contradicted lingering Nazi myths and Soviet propaganda during the Cold War. Several former prisoners became educators, bringing their transformed perspectives into West German classrooms. Others participated in early exchange programs between Germany and the United States, helping rebuild cultural and economic ties between former enemies. Helga Müller, the radio operator whose arrival at the POW camp opened this account, eventually emigrated to the United States in 1952, joining approximately 7,000 other former German women prisoners who chose to build new lives in the country that had been their captor. In a 1977 interview for an oral history project on German-American relations, Müller, by then an American citizen living in Ohio, reflected on her journey. "What I saw in that camp changed everything I believed. The real prison had been in my mind, the lies we had accepted, the limitations we thought were natural. The Americans didn't convert me with propaganda, they did it with abundance. They showed me not just a different way of organizing society, but a different way of imagining what was possible. In Germany, we had been taught that sacrifice was necessary, that scarcity was inevitable. The Americans showed me that human ingenuity, properly organized, could create prosperity beyond anything we had been led to believe possible. That is the lesson I have carried with me for 30 years, that the future can be better than the past if we choose the right principles to guide us." The women captured in American POW camps thus experienced one of history's most effective, if unintentional, programs of ideological conversion. No carefully designed propaganda could have been as persuasive as the lived experience of abundance after scarcity. The simple act of witnessing American material plenty accomplished what no leaflet, radio broadcast, or political re-education lecture could have achieved. The mathematics of defeat were written in everyday objects: the fresh eggs at breakfast, the undarned socks, the abundance of paper and pencils for administrative tasks. Irma Weiss, who had been a mathematics teacher before joining the Women's Auxiliaries, kept a secret tally during her 8 months in American captivity. "I counted everything," she admitted in a 1958 interview. "How many trucks arrived each day? How many new uniforms were issued? How many ration boxes were delivered? I created formulas to estimate total American production based on what I observed in our small camp. Even using conservative estimates, the numbers were overwhelming. I calculated that America produced more aluminum in 1 month than Germany could manufacture in a year. They generated more electrical power in a week than we could in a month." The numerical reality made nonsense of everything we had been told about relative strength and efficiency. This was not a matter of opinion or ideology. It was mathematics. The casual abundance that transformed these prisoners extended to the most mundane aspects of daily life. Margaret Schulz, who had worked as a telephone operator for the Wehrmacht, recalled her astonishment at American writing implements. "They gave us each 2 pencils and a pen when we arrived. When my pencil became short, I went to ask if I could exchange it. The supply officer handed me not 1 but 5 new pencils without recording my name or requiring me to return the stub. In Germany, we sharpened our pencils until they were too small to hold, then attached them to wooden extensions to use every last millimeter of graphite. The Americans simply opened another box of pencils when supplies ran low. They had boxes of boxes. The supply sergeant told me they received more pencils each month than our entire regional headquarters had used in a year." The most devastating comparisons came when prisoners received their first letters from home after Germany's surrender. As civilian conditions in defeated Germany deteriorated during the summer of 1945, women in American captivity found themselves living in relative comfort while their families faced severe shortages. Erika Hoffman, a 25-year-old administrative clerk, shared a letter from her mother with her American supervisor. "My mother writes that they have no electricity for days at a time, that there is no fuel for cooking, that she stands in line for 6 hours to receive a small ration of turnips and flour. Meanwhile, I eat 3 full meals daily. I have hot water and lights. The Americans are bombing our cities and feeding their prisoners better than our citizens ever ate during the war. How do I reconcile these truths? How do I explain to my mother that our enemies are more generous than our own government ever was?" This cognitive dissonance, the simultaneous recognition of American abundance and German deprivation, created the conditions for a profound re-evaluation of national myths. Women who had grown up believing in German cultural and technological superiority now had incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. Those who had accepted the necessity of war as a means of securing German living space could now see that prosperity came not from conquest, but from production. The narrative of noble sacrifice for the fatherland collapsed when confronted with the reality that such sacrifice had been unnecessary, that the material comfort promised as the eventual reward for victory had already been achieved by the supposed materialistic Americans without requiring world domination. The contrast extended beyond material goods to systems and organizations. Lotte Bergmann, who had been a junior administrator in the Reich Labor Service, found herself assigned to clerical duties in the camp headquarters. Her observations of American administrative procedures revealed efficiencies that contradicted everything she had been taught about German organizational superiority. Their filing system used standardized forms and color coding that allowed even new personnel to locate information quickly. Their typewriters, they had so many, were all identical models, which meant parts could be interchanged and everyone could operate any machine. When I suggested a more hierarchical approval process for supply requisitions, the American lieutenant looked confused and asked why they would add unnecessary steps. Their system valued speed and results over process and control. It was disorienting at first, but I came to see that it worked better than our German methods in almost every measurable way. The exposure to American technology proved equally revelatory. Gerda Fischer, a 22-year-old who had trained as a radio operator, described her first encounter with American communications equipment. They allowed several of us with technical training to assist with camp communications maintenance. Their radio sets were not just more numerous, but of fundamentally better design. Components were standardized and modular. A broken part could be quickly replaced without specialized tools or expertise. One American sergeant showed me a field repair manual that any operator could follow. In Germany, we had different procedures for each model, requiring specialized training. Their approach meant faster repairs and less downtime. When I asked the communications officer if these were their newest models, he laughed and said they were already being replaced by better versions. The equipment we considered advanced was already obsolete by their standards. The industrial capacity that produced this technology revealed itself in countless ways. Irene Weber, who had worked in aircraft production before joining the Women's Auxiliaries, found herself speaking with an American pilot during a camp inspection. She later recorded the conversation in a journal. I mentioned that I had helped build Messerschmitt fighters and was proud that we could complete one aircraft every 2 days in our factory at peak efficiency. He nodded politely and said that his hometown of Wichita had a Boeing plant that produced 16 B-17 bombers daily, just one of many such facilities. When I expressed disbelief, he showed me photographs of the production line. The scale was incomprehensible, a factory floor larger than our entire manufacturing complex. That night I lay awake thinking about those images. If what he showed me was true, and I had no reason to doubt the photographs, then everything I had believed about our chances in this war was based on a complete misunderstanding of what we were fighting against. As the months passed, the transformation of the prisoners became visible even in their physical appearance. Camp medical records documented consistent weight gain, improved skin condition, and resolution of nutritional deficiencies. Dr. Helen Clark, an American physician who conducted regular health assessments, noted in an August 1945 report, "The physical transformation of the German women prisoners presents a striking before and after contrast. Upon arrival, most showed signs of long-term nutritional stress, dull hair, poor skin elasticity, dental issues, and amenorrhea in approximately 30% of reproductive age women. After 4 months in captivity, these indicators have largely resolved. Average weight gain is 14 pounds per prisoner. Menstrual function has resumed in all but 3% of cases. The most common complaint now is minor skin irritation from unaccustomed consumption of fatty foods and dairy products. Several have commented that they look American now, by which they seem to mean healthier, with more body fat and better color. The transformation is so pronounced that photographs from their arrival could be mistaken for documentation of different individuals altogether. This physical transformation reinforced the psychological one. Women who had been raised to believe that Germanic physical types represented evolutionary superiority now saw their own bodies change in response to American nutrition. The evidence of their own transformation contradicted racial theories they had been taught since childhood. If proper nutrition could so dramatically alter their appearance and health in mere months, what did this suggest about the supposed inherent differences between peoples? The question undermined the very foundation of Nazi racial ideology. The scope of American resources became even more apparent as the women witnessed the beginning of occupation operations. As Germany surrendered and American forces took control of their occupation zone, the prisoners observed the massive logistics operation that supported not just military forces, but humanitarian aid to the German civilian population. The scale of the Marshall Plan, though not yet formally announced, was becoming visible in the mobilization of resources. Ursula Schmidt, who worked as a translator in the camp administration office, recorded her observations in a journal discovered after her repatriation. Today, I helped process paperwork for 50 trucks of food and medical supplies destined for German civilians in the American zone. These are not minimal survival rations, but substantial provisions: canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, medical supplies, including penicillin and sulfa drugs. When I asked Captain Reynolds if these shipments might deplete American reserves, he looked at me strangely and said, This isn't even a rounding error in our production figures. They are feeding their former enemies while still fighting in the Pacific, while still supplying their allies, while still maintaining full domestic consumption. The productive capacity this represents is beyond anything we imagined possible. For many of the women, this generosity toward former enemies delivered the final blow to Nazi narratives about American vengefulness and moral bankruptcy. Hilda Kaufmann, a 29-year-old who had served in an anti-aircraft auxiliary unit, wrote in a letter cleared by censors in September 1945, "They feed their prisoners better than we fed ourselves. Now they feed our civilians when they have every right to let us starve. Where is the cruelty we were warned about? Where is the retribution? The Americans I have met seem genuinely concerned about rebuilding Germany, about preventing starvation and disease. Some even apologize for conditions they did not create. The contrast with what we were told to expect could not be more stark. I am beginning to understand that this generosity is not weakness. It is the ultimate expression of strength. Only the truly powerful can afford to be magnanimous." The documents and diaries reveal that by late 1945, a remarkable transition had occurred among the German women prisoners. Those who had arrived as committed Nazi supporters, or at least passive acceptors of the regime's worldview, had largely abandoned these beliefs. Intelligence assessments conducted before repatriation found that less than 3% still expressed support for Nazi principles or leadership. More significantly, over 70% actively repudiated their former beliefs when interviewed about post-war reconstruction. The experience of abundance had not merely changed their view of the war, but had fundamentally altered their understanding of economic and social organization. Frida Müller, who had been a district leader in the Nazi Women's League before being called to military service, documented her transformation in a journal later donated to a historical archive. "I believed completely in our cause. I lectured other women about the decadent materialism of America, about the spiritual poverty beneath their supposed wealth. I told them that Germans had something better, a community of purpose, a willingness to sacrifice for a greater good. Now I understand that the real poverty was ours. We sacrificed not because it was noble, but because our system could not produce enough. We embraced scarcity and called it virtue because we could not achieve abundance. The Americans have shown me that material wealth, properly generated and distributed, creates the conditions for human flourishing. Their soldiers are well-fed, well-equipped, and still idealistic. Their apparent materialism supports rather than undermines their values. Everything I taught was backward. Prosperity enables generosity. It does not preclude it." The repatriation process beginning in late 1945 created a new phase in this transformation. As the women prepared to return to a devastated Germany, American authorities developed programs to leverage their changed perspectives. Several hundred were recruited to work as interpreters and administrative assistants in the occupation government. Others received training in democratic procedures and community organization before returning to their hometowns. All received basic information about American Reconstruction plans and were encouraged to share their experiences with their communities. The impact of these returning prisoners on German recovery proved significant, if difficult to quantify precisely. Communities that received larger numbers of women formerly held in American captivity showed measurably faster adaptation to occupation policies. Local administrators noted that these women often served as informal interpreters of American intentions and methods, helping bridge cultural misunderstandings that might otherwise have created friction. Their first-hand experience with American systems gave them unique credibility when explaining new approaches to their fellow citizens. Elsa Wagner, the economics PhD mentioned earlier, became emblematic of this influence. After repatriation to Munich in October 1945, she secured a position with the military government's Economic Reconstruction Team. A 1947 assessment of her work noted, Dr. Wagner's unique combination of German economic training and direct experience with American systems makes her exceptionally effective at adapting U.S. models to German conditions. She has developed modified inventory control systems for 5 key industries that retain American efficiency while accommodating existing German infrastructure. Her background gives her credibility with both American administrators and German industrialists. When German managers express skepticism about American methods, she can point to her own conversion experience rather than simply citing policy directives. The long-term impact extended far beyond the occupation period. Women who had experienced American captivity and then returned to civilian life carried their transformed perspectives into West German society for decades. They raised children with different understandings of abundance and scarcity, of national identity and international relations. Many became supporters of European integration and transatlantic partnership. Their personal experiences created a foundation of cultural understanding that helped sustain the German-American relationship through Cold War tensions. The documentation of this transformation provides a unique window into how beliefs change not through argument but through experience. In this case, the simple reality of American abundance accomplished what no propaganda campaign could have achieved. The German women who entered American captivity as products of Nazi indoctrination left as witnesses to an alternative reality, one in which prosperity came through production rather than conquest, in which systems were judged by results rather than ideology, and in which former enemies could become teachers and eventually allies. Margareta Fischer, the former school teacher whose journal was quoted earlier, perhaps best summarized the lasting impact in a 1972 interview. What I saw in that American camp changed not just my understanding of the war, but my understanding of possibility. Before my capture, I believed that scarcity was natural and abundance exceptional. After living among the Americans, I came to see that human societies can choose abundance through the right systems and values. This knowledge shaped everything I did after returning to Germany, how I taught my students, how I voted, how I raised my children. I taught them that prosperity does not require domination of others, that different is not necessarily inferior, that what seems impossible may simply be unfamiliar. These lessons began in captivity, but have served me throughout my life. Perhaps that is the final irony, that in losing the war, we gained the opportunity to build something better than what we had lost. The transformation of German women prisoners in American POW camps thus stands as a powerful historical example of how direct experience can overturn even deeply held beliefs. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality, between the scarcity they had been taught to valorize and the abundance they witnessed in captivity, created cognitive dissonance that could only be resolved by abandoning previous convictions. Their journey from captives to witnesses to advocates traces the path of Germany's own post-war transformation from enemy to ally, from dictatorship to democracy, from a philosophy of conquest to one of cooperation. In that sense, their personal stories reflect the larger narrative of 20th century Europe, a continent that learned through devastating experience that prosperity comes not from domination, but from production, not from conflict, but from collaboration. This single discovery that abundance is achieved through creation rather than conquest proved the war was already lost long before the final surrender. The women who experienced this revelation in American captivity carried its implications forward into the reconstruction of Germany and the reimagining of Europe. Their transformed understanding helped build the foundation for the peaceful, productive relationships that would eventually replace the conflicts that had defined the first half of the 20th century. In that sense, their captivity served not just as punishment for defeat, but as education for recovery, an unanticipated outcome of a war that destroyed one world to make room for another.